At just 5 years old, she sat alone in the backyard, staring at the earth like it could speak. Then she whispered something no child should ever say. My real mother is in the ground. Everyone dismissed it as imagination, but 20 years later, they dug and found a body. Before we dive deeper into this emotional story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in the suburbs, the kind of afternoon that passes unnoticed. Soft sunlight, gentle breeze, and the scent of grilled chicken rising from open kitchen windows. Cassidy was in her small, cozy kitchen humming absent-mindedly to herself while slicing tomatoes. The house was warm with the smell of rosemary and thyme, and the radio played a gentle tune from a nearby counter. It was supposed to be a simple day, peaceful, uncomplicated. But Cassidy hadn't seen Emily in a while. At first, it didn't bother her. 5-year-olds had their hiding spots. She called out lightly, "Emily?" expecting the usual giggle from behind the curtains or under the dining table. But the silence that answered her wasn't playful. It was too still, too hollow. She wiped her hands on her apron and started checking the rooms, the bedroom, the bathroom, the little reading nook Emily loved. Nothing. Her voice rose just slightly now. "Emily?" Still no response. Then Cassidy stepped out the back door. The backyard was quiet, unnaturally so. No chirping birds, no rustling branches, just that kind of thick, heavy silence that wraps around the air when something isn't right. And there she was, Emily, small, barefoot, and still. Sitting on the grass, her knees pulled up to her chest, arms around them. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, not wandering, not daydreaming, just staring. With an eerie stillness that made Cassidy pause in her tracks. The wind brushed against the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once. But Emily didn't blink, didn't move. It was as though she was listening, waiting for something to speak back. Cassidy walked slowly toward her, her voice soft. "Emily, what are you doing out here, sweetheart? I've been looking everywhere for you." Still no answer. Cassidy crouched beside her, brushing back a strand of her daughter's hair. Then, without turning her head, without blinking, Emily spoke. "My mother is in the ground." Cassidy let out a nervous laugh, the kind you give when your brain doesn't know what else to do. "What did you say, baby?" Emily finally turned her head just slightly. Her eyes were calm, almost too calm. She repeated herself, slower this time. "My real mother. She's in the ground." Cassidy's breath caught, her fingers frozen in Emily's hair. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her chest tightened with confusion, fear, something else she couldn't name. "Sweetheart, you're just tired," she managed at last, her voice trembling more than she expected. "Let's get you inside. You've been out here too long." She reached out her hand. Emily took it, still quiet, still calm, as if she hadn't just said something that made the sky feel heavier. That night, Cassidy couldn't shake it. She tucked Emily into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood in the doorway longer than usual, watching her, listening. But Emily fell asleep like nothing had happened. Downstairs, the house smelled of rosemary again. The dinner was ready. Elijah had just come in from the garage, wiping grease from his hands with a towel. He sat at the dining table as Cassidy placed the plates down, her mind elsewhere. Halfway through the meal, she finally said it. "Elijah, something strange happened today." He looked up from his mashed potatoes, chewing slowly. "It's about Emily," she continued, her voice low. "She was out back, just sitting there, staring at the ground. I asked her what she was doing, and she said her real mother is in the ground." Elijah raised an eyebrow, then scoffed lightly. "She's 5, he said. She probably watched something weird on TV, or maybe one of those creepy cartoons. You know how kids are." Cassidy frowned, but she said it so clearly, like she believed it. Elijah shrugged. "Imagination, that's all it is. Don't overthink it." Cassidy wanted to agree. She really did. But something about the way Emily said it, the way she didn't even blink when she spoke, it sat wrong, like a pebble in her shoe she couldn't shake off. After dinner, while Elijah went to take a shower, Cassidy stood alone in the kitchen. She looked out the window into the darkness, her eyes falling on the same patch of grass where Emily had been sitting earlier. The moonlight touched it gently. Like it too was listening. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "My real mother is in the ground." She wanted to believe it meant nothing. but deep down, something had already begun to crack. That night, after dinner had long settled and Elijah's soft snores drifted from the bedroom, Cassidy stood quietly in the doorway of Emily's room. The hallway light spilled gently across the floor, touching the edges of the little girl's bed. Emily was asleep, curled up with her arms around a stuffed bear, her thumb resting near her mouth, her breathing soft and rhythmic. But Cassidy didn't move. She stood there longer than usual, watching her, studying her face, wondering what went on behind those closed eyes. It had only been a year since Emily came into their lives, but Cassidy remembered every single moment like a necklace she wore close to her chest. She remembered the long months of trying, the pills, the awkward doctor visits, the calendar marked with hopeful circles and silent prayers, and she remembered the day Elijah came home holding a folder with trembling hands. "There's a child," he had said. "She's 3. The paperwork's nearly done. We could bring her home within the week." Cassidy had cried. Not sad tears, but the kind that come from a place deeper than joy. She'd been ready. She'd been waiting. And the day they brought Emily home, Cassidy held her like she had always belonged in her arms. The child had been quiet, shy, eyes scanning everything like she didn't quite trust it yet. But over time, Cassidy had earned her smiles, her laughter, her sleepy hugs. She had become her mother, or so she thought. But now, Cassidy stood in that doorway haunted by 5 small words. "My real mother is in the ground." It was just a sentence, and yet it echoed through her head like a voice calling from somewhere far and buried. No matter how many times she told herself it was just a child's fantasy, it wouldn't go away. At first, she kept it to herself, tried to distract Emily, more games, more hugs, more bedtime stories. She bought new books, made her favorite meals, and even took her to the park more often. But the words kept coming. At the neighbor's barbecue, Emily stood beside the rose bushes and whispered it again to an old woman who leaned in to ask her name. "My real mom is under the flowers." At church, during Sunday school, one of the teachers approached Cassidy with a concerned expression. "Emily said her real mommy is in a hole in the garden. Maybe you should talk to her?" Cassidy laughed then, a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. But her insides had started twisting into knots. One night, well past bedtime, Cassidy woke to the sound of the back door creaking open. She slipped out of bed and padded quietly through the house. Her footsteps were careful, quiet, a mother's instinct. She peeked through the window and saw Emily, standing barefoot in the cold grass, in her nightgown, talking. But she was alone. Cassidy rushed out. The moment Emily saw her, she looked up and smiled softly. "I was telling her I miss her," she said. "She's still down there, but I miss her." Cassidy knelt down, heart thudding. "Who, baby? Who are you talking about?" Emily's face was calm. "My real mother." Cassidy pulled her into her arms, her breath shaking. "Let's get you inside." She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Cassidy sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug she didn't drink from. Elijah walked in, yawning, adjusting the collar of his shirt. "I need to talk to you," Cassidy said quietly. He looked at her, still half asleep. "What's wrong?" She told him everything, the church, the neighbors, the midnight walk. She told him Emily's been repeating the same thing over and over, like it's the only truth she knows. Elijah frowned, already reaching for his car keys. "She's 5. She's a child. Kids say weird things, Cass. Don't be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic," she insisted. "It's not just once. It's over and over. She's obsessed. She's talking to the ground, Elijah." He sighed heavily, standing at the door. "She'll grow out of it. Just ignore it. Stop feeding into it." Then he left. Cassidy sat there for a while. The clock ticked, the kettle whistled, and all she could feel was the sound of silence pressing into her chest. Later that week, she got the call. Emily's school. The voice on the other end was polite but firm. "Hi, Mrs. Raines. We're calling about Emily. There's been some concern. She's been telling other children that her real mommy is buried in the backyard. Some of them are frightened. We've had complaints from parents. Look, we know children can have wild imaginations, but this has become disruptive." Cassidy closed her eyes as the words sank in. "We're going to suggest that Emily take some time off, maybe try homeschooling for a while. And if you haven't already, it may help to seek professional help. A child psychologist, maybe." Cassidy thanked them, hung up, and sat on the floor. It was too much to ignore now. She loved Emily. She loved her like flesh and blood. But now she was left wondering, what if this wasn't imagination? What if Emily wasn't confused at all? What if she remembered? The next morning, Cassidy sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone. For the fifth time, she scrolled past the same number, a local child therapist named Dr. Megan Sims. Her finger hovered over the call button, then pressed it. That evening, after dinner, she brought it up. "Elijah, I think we need help." He looked up from the television, remote in one hand, a glass of soda in the other. "What kind of help?" he asked. "Professional help," she replied cautiously. "For Emily. I found someone, a child therapist, someone who can talk to her, maybe understand what's going on." Elijah scoffed immediately, shaking his head. "Oh, come on, Cassidy. A therapist? Really?" Cassidy leaned forward. "Yes, really. She's not okay, Elijah. Something is wrong. She keeps saying the same thing. She draws strange things. She talks to herself at night. She wanders out of bed. It's not just pretend anymore." Elijah stood up, clearly agitated. "She's 5. 5. Kids make stuff up. You start dragging her to therapists, you'll just scare her more." "No, what's scaring her is whatever memory she's carrying," Cassidy snapped, her voice rising before she could stop it. "You don't see what I see. You're never here when it happens." Elijah's jaw tightened. He picked up his keys from the counter. "You do what you want," he muttered as he walked out. "But don't drag me into it." The door slammed. Cassidy stood there for a moment, then slowly sank into the chair. She wasn't trying to blame anyone. She just wanted her daughter to be okay, even if that meant hearing things she wasn't ready for. 2 days later, Cassidy and Emily sat in a soft-lit office, walls covered in pastel murals of forests and friendly animals. A small shelf of toys stood in one corner. Dr. Megan sat across from them, kind eyes behind round glasses, her tone gentle and measured. Emily clung to her stuffed bear but didn't seem afraid. She looked curious. Dr. Megan asked simple questions about favorite colors, foods, games. Emily answered politely. Then Dr. Megan gave her some paper and colored pencils. "Draw anything you like," she said with a smile. Emily picked up a brown crayon first, then black, then red. She drew slowly, with focus. Cassidy sat quietly nearby, watching. When she was done, Dr. Megan asked, "Can you tell me about your drawing?" Emily nodded and pointed. "That's the hole. That's where they put her." "Who, sweetie?" "My first mommy." "And who's that?" "That's the man who put her there." Dr. Megan paused, eyes drifting to the sketch. There was a hole in the middle of the page. Inside it, a figure with long brown hair. Next to it, another figure, tall, featureless, with a dark outline where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just a shape. Cassidy felt her chest grow heavy. After the session, Dr. Megan sat with Cassidy privately. "I've seen children draw monsters," she said gently. "Imaginary friends, sad things. But Emily's drawings aren't random. They're specific. They're layered. She's expressing something she believes to be true." Cassidy leaned forward. "But she was just 3 when we adopted her." Dr. Megan nodded. "Exactly. Most children don't retain strong episodic memories from that age. But trauma sometimes roots itself deeper. When something extreme happens, the brain doesn't always forget." Cassidy felt her breath catch. "You think this could be real?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Dr. Megan said carefully, "but I believe Emily believes it." Back at home, Cassidy placed the drawing on the kitchen table and stared at it. The hole, the woman, the faceless man. She picked up her phone to call Elijah, then changed her mind. What was the point? That night, after putting Emily to bed, Cassidy returned to the kitchen. The silence in the house was thick, almost humming. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the table. Her hands trembled. "I'm trying," she whispered to no one. "I'm really trying." Her eyes welled with tears. She pressed her palms against her face, quietly sobbing into them. Maybe I shouldn't have adopted. Maybe I wasn't ready. She hated herself for thinking that. It made her feel small, ungrateful. But the weight of what she didn't understand was pressing harder every day. She wiped her tears quickly when she heard footsteps. But it was only the wind brushing past the window, making the tree branches tap lightly on the glass. Cassidy looked out at the backyard, the moonlight casting shadows across the grass. She didn't say a word, but somewhere deep in her gut, she began to fear that Emily's words weren't a fantasy. They were a memory. Dinner was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful, but fragile. like a silence trying to survive in a room filled with things unsaid. The clinking of silverware was the only sound. Elijah sat at the head of the table, speaking casually about his day. Something about a tool shipment that was late, a client that changed their mind about a custom design. His voice moved like nothing in the world had shifted, like everything was still as it should be. Cassidy sat across from him, pushing green beans around her plate, nodding in all the right places, but not really hearing anything. Her eyes kept drifting toward Emily, who sat beside her, unusually quiet. She hadn't touched her food. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't humming. She wasn't even blinking much. She just sat there, still, stiff. Her little fingers curled tightly around the edge of her chair. Cassidy noticed. She always noticed. "Elijah," she said softly, cutting into his rambling. "Emily hasn't said a word all evening." Elijah glanced over and waved a hand. "She's just tired. Aren't you, kiddo?" Emily didn't respond. Elijah picked up his glass and took a long sip of water. Cassidy leaned over slightly to Emily, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You okay, baby?" Still, no answer. Cassidy's stomach began to twist. She looked at Elijah, who had already gone back to eating like nothing was wrong. Then, out of nowhere, like lightning cracking open a cloudless sky, Emily slammed her tiny hand flat on the table. The plates jumped. The water in Cassidy's glass rippled. Everyone froze. Emily stood from her chair, her small body trembling, voice shaking but loud enough to pierce the silence. "It was you," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at Elijah. "You put Mummy in the ground. I saw you." The words didn't just land. They hit like a bomb. The room dropped into stillness so heavy it felt like the walls were listening. Elijah's face changed instantly, from surprise to rage. He stood so fast his chair scraped across the floor. His hand came down hard on the table. "You shut your filthy mouth," he shouted. "You don't talk to me like that." Cassidy's voice cracked like the snap of a brittle branch. She was still holding Emily close, shielding her like her body could block out the venom that had just filled the room. Her heart pounded so loud in her ears it almost drowned out her own voice. She looked up at Elijah, really looked at him. His face was red, his chest rising and falling, his fists trembling at his sides. But what caught her off guard wasn't just his rage. It was the look beneath it. There was something else. Not frustration, not confusion. Fear. It flashed across his eyes for just a second before he turned away. But Cassidy saw it. And once you see fear like that in someone's face, you don't forget it. Cassidy stood, her voice quieter now but firm. "You need to leave the room." Elijah stared at her, unblinking. "Now," she said again, sharper. He hesitated, then turned without a word and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was loaded. Cassidy knelt down beside Emily again. The little girl was shaking, her lip quivering, eyes wide but dry. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared at the spot where her father had stood, like she was trying to make sure he was really gone. Cassidy reached for her hands, and for the first time they felt colder than usual. "It's okay now," she whispered. "It's just me. I'm here." Emily didn't speak, but after a few moments, she slowly nodded. Cassidy sat beside her until her breathing calmed. Then she scooped her up in her arms, gently carried her to her room, and tucked her in beneath the blankets. She didn't ask more questions. Not tonight. The little girl had said enough. As Cassidy sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes wandered to the bookshelf, the stuffed animals, the mobiles spinning slowly from the ceiling. All the things they had carefully picked out together when she first came home. This room was supposed to be her safe space, so why did it now feel like it had been built on lies? Cassidy lingered in the doorway longer than usual again. Only this time, it wasn't to admire how peaceful Emily looked in sleep. It was to make sure she was really okay. Then she turned and walked to her own bedroom. Elijah wasn't there. The bed was made. The light was off. She found him in the basement, sitting on the edge of his old workbench, staring at nothing in particular. A beer in his hand. She didn't speak to him. He didn't look up. She just walked past him, climbed back upstairs, and closed the bedroom door behind her. That night, sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's face, pale, frightened, yet bold, with the kind of clarity only children have when they're telling the truth. "It was you. You put Mummy in the ground? I saw you." And now, Cassidy couldn't stop seeing it too. Cassidy didn't speak much for the next few days. She moved like someone living underwater. Everything was slower, heavier, muffled by the noise in her own head. But inside, her mind was loud, screaming with questions, rewinding every word, every moment, every little detail she once overlooked. She couldn't forget Emily's voice at the table, the way she had pointed at Elijah, the calmness in her accusation, and she couldn't forget Elijah's face, the rage, the panic, the fear behind the anger. At night, after everyone was asleep, Cassidy found herself downstairs, barefoot in the dim kitchen light, flipping through drawers she hadn't opened in years. The bottom drawer, the old file boxes. She pulled out a worn brown folder labeled Emily in Elijah's handwriting. Inside were the adoption papers, vaccination records, a birth certificate, all of it arranged too neatly, too perfectly. She sat at the table, spread it all out in front of her. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. Elijah had said he had a friend in child services who helped them skip the long waiting process. He brought home the documents one night with a quiet smile and said, "She's ours." Back then, she didn't question it. She was so desperate to become a mother, to believe that fate had finally turned in her favor, that she clung to the miracle. She told herself love was more important than the details. But now, she studied every page like it was a puzzle that had never quite fit together. The agency name printed at the top of the forms looked unfamiliar. She typed it into her phone. No results. She tried calling the contact number printed on the form. The line rang twice. Then an automated message, "This number is no longer in service." A coldness spread through her chest. The next morning, Cassidy drove to the address listed for the agency. It was a 30-minute drive outside of town, a quiet road lined with old trees. When she pulled up, she saw a rusted mailbox in a building that hadn't seen life in years. The sign was cracked. The windows were boarded up. She sat in the car for a long time, just staring. Something wasn't right. Back at home, she went through Elijah's drawers while he was at work, his desk, his laptop. Nothing stood out, not directly, but it was all too clean, like someone had tidied up on purpose. Later that week, she received a call from Dr. Megan. Cassidy stepped outside to take it, standing on the back porch while Emily napped inside. "I wanted to update you on some of the things we're noticing," Dr. Megan said gently. "Emily's been sleepwalking. She's also talking in her sleep, very clearly. She often says things like, 'Mom, don't scream.'" Cassidy felt her breath catch in her throat. "Has she said anything else?" she asked, voice low. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sometimes she whispers things that don't fully make sense, sentences that seem broken, like fragments of a memory. But what stands out is how consistent they are. She always says them in the same tone, the same order, like she's remembering." Cassidy thanked her and ended the call. She didn't go back inside right away. She stood there on the porch, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes locked on that same patch of ground where Emily had once sat. She remembered Elijah once saying the adoption process had taken just under 3 weeks, that he'd handled most of it through connections. She had been so grateful, she didn't ask more. But now all she could think was, why did it all happen so fast? And why did he want it to? For the first time, she looked at the man she married and couldn't recognize him. It started gradually. At first, Cassidy thought Emily was just restless, the way kids get when they're growing, or anxious, or overtired. But the dreams came more often. Emily would toss and turn at night, mumbling, then wake up with a jolt, eyes wide, breathing fast, her little hands clutching the blankets like she was falling through something invisible. Cassidy would rush in, sit beside her, and gently brush the sweat from her forehead. "It's okay, baby. It was just a dream." But Emily would shake her head and whisper, "It wasn't a dream. I remember it." One night, Cassidy stayed by her side after she fell asleep, just to watch, just to understand. Emily twitched slightly, her face tightening. Then her lips began to move, her voice barely audible. "She's singing again. I can hear her. She's singing." A pause, then a whimper. "She's scared. She's screaming now. It's too loud." Cassidy's hand trembled. Emily began to cry softly in her sleep. "Don't cover her. Don't put the dirt." Her voice broke. "She's still moving." Cassidy felt every muscle in her body lock. She leaned in closer, her hand gently rubbing Emily's back. The little girl began to sob now, not loudly, not wildly, but with that deep, aching grief that no child should ever carry. She whispered one last thing before falling quiet again. Her hands were reaching, but he didn't stop. Cassidy sat there frozen, the blanket clutched in her fingers. These weren't just dreams. These were fragments, images, memories. And she knew, with a weight that crushed her heart, that Emily wasn't just imagining things. She was remembering. 20 years had passed. 20 birthdays. 20 Christmases. 20 years of trying and failing to forget what no one else believed ever happened. Emily was now 25. To anyone who met her, she looked composed, neat, ordinary. She worked at a small publishing company in the city, a quiet office on the third floor of a nondescript building where the coffee always tasted burnt and the printer jammed at least once a day. Her desk sat near the window, tucked into a corner she never decorated. No framed photos, no little inspirational quotes, no sign of the past. Her coworkers noticed. They all had snapshots pinned to their cubicle walls, families on beaches, boyfriends with awkward grins, dogs in Halloween costumes. Emily had nothing, except for one old, weathered cardboard box she kept locked in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. Most people thought it held old manuscripts, but inside were papers she'd carried with her from childhood, school drawings, newspaper clippings, scribbled notes she'd written at 10, 15, 20, pieces of thoughts she never dared say aloud. And most importantly, the adoption file. She'd looked through it more times than she could count, memorized the names, the signatures, the seals. And yet, every time she opened it, she felt that same uneasy knot twist in her stomach, like something inside the pages didn't want to be seen. Her life had been shaped by whispers, not just the ones others gave behind her back, but the ones that lived inside her own head. She had tried therapy. It helped her sleep, helped her cope, but it never quieted the one thing she couldn't let go. Everyone said I was just imagining it, but I remember him, putting her in the ground. Sometimes that line echoed in her mind when she blinked too slowly. Other times it came back in flashes, the cold night air, the sound of digging, the woman's voice crying out from somewhere below. They told her it wasn't real. They told her she was 3 years old. But memory doesn't always follow rules. Some memories live in the body, and hers never stopped shaking when she saw fresh soil. That morning, after a rough night of barely sleeping, Emily arrived at work early. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't even take off her coat. She just walked to her desk, pulled out the box, and sat down in the quiet. She opened the folder for the 100th time. Her fingers brushed over the papers like she was touching a ghost. And then, for the first time, she noticed it. It was subtle, a missing county seal on the top left corner of the adoption certificate. Just a blank circle where a stamp should have been. Her eyes narrowed, her pulse quickened. She flipped to the next page, a consent form, supposedly signed by a family court judge. But something about the handwriting didn't sit right. The signature looked shaky, off-center, almost as if someone had copied it from another paper. She pulled out her phone and Googled the judge's name. Her heart dropped. The judge had died 6 months before the date on the form. Her hands began to tremble. She pressed her palms to her lap, trying to stay steady, trying not to draw attention from anyone walking by her cubicle. This couldn't be coincidence. This was a lie. She pulled out her notepad and began writing down every detail, every inconsistency, every date, every contact. By lunch, she had already requested public records from the family court clerk's office. By evening, she had emailed 3 separate agencies for information about the adoption agency listed on the documents, even though she already knew it didn't exist anymore. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was certain. Someone had forged those papers, and she had a feeling she already knew who. The next Sunday, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that felt heavier than rain. Emily sat in her car outside the small house she once called home. The same house with the backyard she used to fear. The same kitchen where screams had once filled the air like broken glass. It had been years since she and Cassidy had spoken in person. There were the occasional birthday cards, a quiet call on holidays, but time had stretched the bond between them thin, not broken, just frayed. But now Emily needed answers, not memories, not comfort, truth. She took a slow breath, stepped out of the car, and walked up to the front porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. Cassidy stood there, older now, The streaks of gray in her hair weren't there the last time Emily visited. Her face had softened in places, hardened in others, but her eyes, they were still the same, gentle, watchful, unsure. "Emily," she said, almost like a question. "I need to talk to you," Emily replied quietly. Cassidy stepped aside. Inside, the house hadn't changed much. The same family portraits still lined the hallway, except none of them had Emily in them past the age of 12. Whether that was an oversight or intentional, Emily couldn't say. They sat at the dining table. Cassidy offered tea. Emily declined. There was no small talk. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the adoption file, the same one Elijah once handed over like it was a blessing from above. She opened it to the page with the missing seal, then the forged signature. Then, softly but clearly, she said, "This isn't real." Cassidy stared at the page, eyes scanning the lines slowly. Then, her shoulders dropped. She didn't even ask what Emily meant. She didn't deny it. She didn't stall. She just whispered, "I didn't know." Emily looked at her, not angry, not cold, just searching. Cassidy went on. "Elijah handled everything. He said he had connections, that it would be easier that way. I never thought to question it. I was so desperate to be a mother. We'd tried for 2 years. Doctors kept saying it wasn't going to happen naturally. And then he brought you home." She placed a hand gently on the file. "He said you were abandoned, that your parents were gone. I just believed him." There was silence between them for a moment, the kind of silence that only happens between two people who both feel betrayed, but in different ways. Then Emily spoke. "I'm going to take a DNA test." Cassidy nodded, her voice soft. "You should." 3 days later, the kit arrived. Emily did it alone, in her apartment. No one watching, no one helping. She sealed the envelope with shaking fingers. 2 weeks after that, the results arrived in her inbox. The email subject line was simple: cold. DNA relationship test results completed. She clicked, she scanned, and then her hand flew to her mouth. Elijah Raines, 99.98 probability, biological father. Emily sat back in her chair, her vision blurring. He wasn't just the man who raised her. He was the man who made her. And suddenly, everything shifted. Because that meant the woman in the ground, the woman she remembered, the woman screaming. She wasn't buried under someone else's trauma. She was Emily's mother. And Cassidy wasn't her real mother. The woman who had tucked her in, made her lunches, brushed her hair, wasn't the woman who had given her life. And yet, she had loved her. Now Emily didn't know what to feel. Gratitude? Betrayal? Grief? Back at the old house, Cassidy sat in the kitchen when the phone rang. She answered on the second ring, already knowing who it was. Emily's voice was quiet. "It was him. He's my father." Cassidy said nothing. "You're not my mother," Emily added softly. Not with anger, just fact. There was a pause. Then Cassidy, in a voice barely more than a breath, replied, "I know." She sat there for a long time after the call ended. A cup of tea went cold beside her. Her fingers touched the table like she was searching for something that wasn't there. Her whole identity, the one she built over decades of lullabies, scraped knees, and birthday candles, now sat on a line between real and pretend. She had been a mother in every way that mattered, except for the one that the world would now talk about. The house felt different now. Even though the walls were the same, even though the furniture hadn't moved and the photos still hung in their usual places, something had changed. It was in the silence, in the way footsteps echoed down the hallway, in the way Cassidy's chest tightened every time she heard Elijah's voice from the next room. There had once been a time when she trusted him completely, when she believed every word he said was grounded in love, in care, in reason. But now that trust had been replaced with something colder, suspicion, and quiet dread. Cassidy didn't want to fight. She didn't want to accuse. But there were questions, heavy, lingering questions that refused to go away. That evening, after Elijah had come home from work, she watched him from across the kitchen as he rinsed paint off his hands. He talked about a fence he was building, a client who didn't like the stain color. He spoke like everything was normal, like he hadn't stolen someone's life. Cassidy waited for the right moment. Her voice was steady when it finally came. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Elijah turned slowly, drying his hands with a towel. He raised an eyebrow like he hadn't heard her right. "What?" She didn't blink. "About Emily, about before she came here." Elijah scoffed, tossing the towel on the counter. Not this again, Cass. We've been over this. She's our daughter. That's all that matters. Cassidy folded her arms across her chest. But you're her father, her biological father. Elijah went still. His eyes narrowed, but his voice remained casual. Where are you getting that from? She took a DNA test. He looked away, jaw clenching. You let her do that? Cassidy didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elijah sighed, ran a hand through his hair. Cass, this is exactly the kind of drama I was trying to avoid. I did what I had to do. We couldn't have a child, and she needed a home. What's the difference? Cassidy stared at him. There it was again. That chilling calmness. That ability to talk about life-altering deception like it was a paperwork error. You forged adoption documents, Elijah. You hid the truth about her mother. You lied to me, to both of us. His face darkened, but he said nothing. Cassidy shook her head slowly. There's something you're still not telling me. No, there's not, he said quickly. Too quickly. She didn't push further. She knew that tone. It was the one he used when he felt the walls closing in. That night, Cassidy took a pillow and a blanket and went to sleep in the guest room. She didn't explain. She didn't say it was temporary. She just walked past him with silent footsteps and closed the door behind her. And when Elijah asked, quietly from down the hall, Cass, she didn't answer. The next morning, Cassidy sat in her car for a long time before picking up the phone. Emily answered on the second ring. I'm ready to do whatever you need me to do, Cassidy said. Her voice was calm but resolute. There was a pause on the other end. You're sure? Emily asked. Yes. I didn't know how deep this went, but I believe you now. I should have believed you a long time ago. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to dig. I want to know if what I saw was real. I want to know who she was. Cassidy closed her eyes and nodded slowly to herself. Then I'll stand beside you. Because even though Cassidy hadn't given Emily life, she was finally ready to help her reclaim it. The courthouse was quiet that morning, at least on the outside. Gray clouds hovered low over the building, heavy with rain that hadn't yet begun to fall. It was the kind of sky that made people move slower, speak softer, and stare at the ground a little longer. But inside one of the courtrooms, Emily stood tall. She had never been in a courtroom before. Not like this. Not as a petitioner. Not with her hands shaking slightly inside her coat pockets and her breath catching each time she blinked. Beside her sat a quiet attorney, someone Cassidy had helped her hire. He didn't know the whole story, not the dreams, not the buried voices, but he had the documents, the missing signatures, the forged seal, the false judge's name. And now something else, a missing person report, filed 20 years ago, buried in an archive in another state. A woman named Marina Kessler, brown hair, early 30s, last seen leaving a clinic with a small child. The photo was faded, but Emily knew those eyes, because she had them too. The motion was straightforward, a request to excavate the backyard of the Raines' home. Emily had labeled it with facts and legal language. But beneath every line, there was something deeper. A plea not just for justice, but for truth. She watched the judge as he read through the documents. An older man, reserved, sharp eyes. He didn't speak for a long time, just flipped through the evidence, line by line. Cassidy sat in the second row, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. She hadn't spoken much that morning, but her presence said everything Emily needed to hear. When the judge finally looked up, he cleared his throat and spoke evenly. Miss Raines, based on the materials submitted and considering the inconsistencies and legal concerns regarding the adoption process, I'm granting your request. You have the court's permission to proceed with a supervised excavation. Local authorities will be notified to oversee the process. Emily didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once, lips pressed into a firm line, her throat burning. Outside the courthouse, the air felt thicker. Reporters had already gathered, drawn by the whispers of a possible buried body and a long cold mystery finally thawing. Microphones were extended. Cameras flashed. But Emily said nothing. She climbed into the back seat of Cassidy's car and stared out the window in silence. The excavation was scheduled for 2 days later. In that time, Emily barely slept. She reread every file, every note, every news article she had found about Marina. She looked at the photo until the ink bled into her memory. And when the morning came, she dressed quietly. Black jeans, a long coat, hair pulled back, no makeup, no distractions. This wasn't for show. This was for her. When she arrived at the house, the street had already been taped off. 2 police cruisers, a coroner's van, a forensic team unpacking equipment. Neighbors stood in clumps, murmuring behind hands. News vans lined the curb. Cassidy stayed near the porch. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Emily walked toward the backyard slowly, her shoes crunching lightly over the grass. She stopped at the edge of the marked site, the same spot she had stared at when she was 5, the same patch of ground she had talked to, the same earth that had never let her forget. She watched as officers and forensic techs began to dig, careful, methodical, removing the topsoil layer by layer. Every scrape of the shovel felt like a heartbeat. Emily stood still, her hands clenched tightly by her sides. She whispered to herself, softly, almost inaudibly, "She's there. I know she is." And for the first time in her life, she knew that no one could call her crazy again. The digging began just after noon. The sky had turned a shade darker, though no rain had come yet. The breeze was still, but there was something electric in the air. The kind of charged silence that made everyone speak softer and move slower. Police officers stood along the edges of the backyard, arms folded, radios clipped to their shoulders. Forensic technicians crouched near the taped perimeter, logging tools, checking measurements, documenting every movement. Emily stood about 6 feet away, just beyond the caution line, watching every stroke of the shovel like her life depended on it. The hole was getting deeper. They had marked the area based on a combination of Emily's memory and soil readings. The forensic team had determined the ground in that spot had been disturbed at some point in the past, the layers inconsistent, the compaction different. But no one said it aloud. No one wanted to be the first to say what they were really looking for. Cassidy stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, eyes locked on the ground. And Elijah wasn't there. He'd left that morning without a word. Emily didn't ask where he'd gone. She knew. After nearly 2 hours of careful excavation, one of the technicians called for a pause. He stepped back, adjusting his gloves, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He leaned down again, brushed more soil away with a trowel. Slower now, focused. Then the sound came. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable. A dull metallic scrape. The shovel had hit something. The technician froze. Everyone around the site went still. Another tech stepped forward, crouching beside him. They whispered something, then waved an officer over. Within moments, the site was cleared, except for 2 techs and the lead forensic investigator. Emily didn't move. She couldn't. One of the officers approached her gently. "We found something. You may want to sit down." But Emily shook her head. She stepped forward, and then she saw it. Just beneath the layers of disturbed soil, partially wrapped in what looked like faded fabric, browned by time and rot, was the shape of a ribcage. The bones were brittle but intact. A few inches away lay what looked like a scrap of blue cotton, a torn piece of what was once clothing. Then, slightly deeper, a silver ring, still on a thin, decayed finger. Emily didn't speak. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she sank to the grass, slowly, quietly, as if her body had just stopped trying to hold the grief in. She stared at the hole, at the broken, silent remains of the woman whose screams had haunted her dreams since childhood. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my mother. After all these years." Cassidy knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on her back. Neither woman cried loudly. There were no screams, no dramatic outbursts, just the sound of dirt being carefully brushed away and the soft wind beginning to move again. Later, when the remains were recovered, bagged, and taken for testing, Emily sat alone in the living room. The house felt unfamiliar again, smaller, heavier. A detective came in after dusk and sat across from her. He handed her a piece of paper. "The preliminary autopsy is in." She took it with steady hands. "Read it in silence. Female. Approximate age, early 30s. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Time of death, estimated over 20 years ago." The DNA test followed the next day. It was a match. The body was confirmed to be Marina Kessler, Emily's biological mother. The woman whose voice had echoed in her sleep, whose hands had reached through the soil of her memory, begging not to be forgotten. Now, she wouldn't be. It happened on a Wednesday. The sun was high, the heat thick, and the world, to anyone else, looked ordinary. But not to Elijah. He was at a construction site on the outskirts of town. working on a residential patio. His hands were covered in cement dust, his boots sinking into the soft ground. He gave orders casually, like nothing in his life had changed, like there weren't detectives building a case against him, like the backyard where he'd buried a secret hadn't just given up its silence. He didn't know they were coming, but they were. Two unmarked cars pulled up beside the site, followed by a cruiser. Officers stepped out, plainclothes and uniformed. The foreman looked confused. A few of the crew paused what they were doing, and then the lead detective said it. "Elijah Raines? You're under arrest." Elijah blinked. He looked around like they had the wrong man, like maybe someone else was standing behind him. But there was no one. They read him his rights as they cuffed him, the cold click of steel against his wrists echoing in the open air. A couple of workers stared. One of them reached for his phone. Another muttered, "What the hell's going on?" Elijah didn't speak. Not at first. Cassidy watched it unfold from across the street, standing in the shadow of a parked car. She hadn't told him they were coming. She didn't warn him. She just stood there, quietly, tears running down her cheeks, arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched the man she once loved, the man she married, being led away in handcuffs. She didn't know what she felt. Grief, maybe, shame, definitely, but mostly relief, because now it was no longer just a suspicion, it was real. Elijah was booked that same afternoon. Inside the interrogation room, he sat across from two detectives. His hands were still dirty, his face blank, not angry, not sad, just blank. They told him the charges: forgery of legal adoption documents, concealment of a homicide, illegal burial without a death certificate, and finally, suspicion of second-degree murder. At first, he denied everything. He said he'd adopted Emily legally, that the paperwork had been processed through private channels, that the mother had disappeared, run off, abandoned them both, that he didn't know where she went. But the detectives didn't stop there. They showed him the body, the DNA match, the trauma to the skull. They showed him Marina's missing person report, the last sighting, the timeline, the photo. And that's when Elijah's hands started to tremble. He leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling for a long time. And then he said, almost like he was talking to himself, she was going to ruin everything. No tears, no apologies, just that one sentence, like her death had been an inconvenience, like her life, her voice, her child, had stood in the way of what he wanted most: control, comfort, an easy life built on a lie. He never explained more, but he didn't need to, because the truth had already been unearthed. The cemetery was quiet. A gentle breeze moved through the trees like a whisper. The grass was freshly cut. The sky hung low and pale, neither bright nor dark, just soft and gray, like the world had paused for a moment of stillness. Emily stood at the grave alone at first, a simple headstone, clean lines, no flowers yet, just a name etched into stone that had waited 20 years to be spoken out loud. Marina Kessler, beloved mother, finally found. Cassidy joined her a few minutes later. She didn't say anything right away. She just stood beside her, hands folded, looking down at the name. For a long while, there was only silence. Then Cassidy spoke. Her voice was quiet, tiredness. "I know I'm not your real mother, but I love you like you were born of me." Emily didn't look at her right away. She kept her eyes on the stone. Her throat tightened, her fingers trembled, and then she said, "You are my mother. You're the only one who truly loved me." Cassidy let out a quiet breath. Her hand reached for Emily's, and Emily didn't pull away. The pain between them hadn't vanished, but in that moment, it wasn't what defined them. It was the love, steady, imperfect, and real. In the weeks that followed, Emily returned to therapy, this time not just to cope, but to heal. She talked about the dreams, the years of confusion, the way it felt to carry a truth that no one believed. She talked about Marina, the woman she barely knew but couldn't forget, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to rebuild. She started journaling. At first it was messy, disorganized, just scattered memories and feelings on a page. But one evening something clicked. She sat at her desk, pulled out a fresh notebook, and wrote the title across the top, "The Girl Who Spoke to the Ground." It wasn't just a story. It was a promise, to herself, to Marina, to every child who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or buried beneath someone else's lie. And for the first time in her life, Emily wasn't afraid to be heard. For 20 years, her truth was buried, dismissed as a child's fantasy. But some memories never fade, some whispers never die, and the ground, it never forgets. Here brings us to the end of the story. If this touched your heart or made you think, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Humanity Stories for more powerful, real-life inspired narratives like this one. And if you have thoughts, emotions, or similar experiences to share, leave a comment below. We read every single one, because some stories deserve to be heard.